Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everyone, wherever you are joining us from. I'm Tim Menke, one of the co-chairs of the German-American Conference 2020 at Harvard. Our motto this year is Neustart, or overhaul, restart in English. And Neustart is what the world is facing today, with the effects of COVID, a troubled economy, and systemic inequality felt in many places around the world. In this light, we've decided to do things a bit differently from our traditional 3-day in-person event. So this year, we're hosting a virtual event series throughout the fall. This series would not be possible without our amazing team before and behind the scenes in event planning, communications, and digital logistics. And we also thank our generous partner Wunderbar Together, the year of the German-American friendship. Just a few logistical notes before we start. We will be bringing in audience questions in the second half of the discussion. Please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. Also, our book raffle winners for the book World in Danger by Ambassador Ischinger will be notified via email. Finally, when engaging in this event, you are required to adhere to our code of conduct. With this, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Leon.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to have you all with us today. My name is Leonhard Falke. I'm a student at the Kennedy School and part of the German-American Conference team as well. So why are we having this conversation today? The transatlantic security relationship is strong and has been strong for decades, but the last 4 years have also shown just how fragile this relationship can be. We live in a changing world, and European and US interests are changing as well. So what is the future of the transatlantic partnership? European expectations towards the Biden administrations are certainly high, to put it mildly. Just yesterday, French Foreign Minister Le Drian and the German Foreign Minister Maas published a call in the Washington Post for a transatlantic New Deal and really want to start working together again. The list is long, China, Russia, Iran, so there are many challenges. There's huge potential for cooperation, but it certainly won't be easy. Luckily, we have two fabulous speakers today with us to talk about what it really takes to make this work again, what the key challenges are, and so on. We have Ambassador Ischinger with us. He's a German career diplomat, probably doesn't need much of an introduction. He served as the ambassador to the United States, actually starting his first day on 9/11/2001, and to London. Currently, or since 2008, he's the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. And he recently published his book, World in Danger, and he will certainly talk about that in a second. We also have with us Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook. Among many other things, she is the founding executive director of the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard. She's the executive director for the project on Europe and the transatlantic relationship, and really is an expert in the transatlantic relations. If you follow German television on election night, you probably saw her. I'm still impressed how she stayed up all night. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us. Let's have a warm round of a virtual welcoming applause, and over to you, Cathryn.
Well, thank you, Leonhard, Tim, and everybody here. I'm thrilled to share even a virtual space with Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, who, in addition to his accolades, which were just enumerated, was a fellow at the Future of Diplomacy project, where I think he really contributed his nuanced insight on the transatlantic relationship. But Wolfgang Ischinger would not be who he is as the chair of the Munich Security Conference for such a long time if he didn't always have an extremely global perspective on the transnational issues that we face and as they collide with the rise in global competition. And so before we get into all of the issues around the transatlantic relationship, I wanted to actually stay with your book a little bit, Ambassador Ischinger, which despite the many policy reports that the Munich Security Conference offers for the wonks and policymakers, you felt it was important to reflect for a wider audience, for those of us who feel affected by these tectonic shifts in the international relations, to reflect personally on the dangers that you see in the world and how we might think about resolving them together and how we might anchor solutions in some of our partnerships. So I thought maybe to open, you could tell us why this book now, and where do you see the eminence of danger in our current situation?
Okay, first of all, Cathryn, let me say thank you for having me on this program. When I served in the US during my years as ambassador, I really made it a point, as you know very well, to go to Harvard University and to spend a day or so at the Kennedy School and with others to listen, trying to listen to all these experienced and smart people. And I really regret that I haven't had a chance to do this year because of the pandemic. I was hoping to do a kind of a book tour to talk about my book, physically in Boston, in New York, in Washington, and elsewhere. But thanks for having me, and it gives me a wonderful opportunity to talk a little bit about my concerns and transatlantic policy issues. And of course, it's a wonderful time now, just a few days after your elections have taken place, and we have a perspective regarding the coming period, the next several years. Now, just one point on the book. I'm actually not a fan of books written by diplomats, because most of these books are really not interesting to read. It's mostly stuff about, making people sound important and what kind of central role they have played in shaping their country's destiny. So I was never really interested in that until somebody came to me and said, you need to explain to the German public, not to the expert community, but to the wider public, what it is that makes foreign policy successful or not successful, and that foreign policy decisions are not always a choice between, standing on the moral high ground and doing something awful, but that it is mostly the difficult question of choosing between 2 or 3 or 4 bad options. And your job as a good diplomat, as a good policymaker, is to choose the least bad one. So it's mostly shades of gray. And that was really the original purpose of the book, to explain how hard it is really, how easy it is to talk about foreign policy, but how hard it is to make the right decisions and not the wrong ones. And I'm really so pleased that I was able to find at the Brookings Institution a publisher who was willing to present this to an English-speaking audience, which is of course so much larger than the German audience. But quite frankly, I also learned that in order to make it ready for a non-German audience, I actually had to rewrite a number of chapters almost completely, because the kinds of references that you make about, Helmut Schmidt or Konrad Adenauer are probably not references that you can make without explaining who that might have been to a non-German audience. So a lot of work had to go into the revised American edition. Now, what about the concerns? When we talked about the title of the book, Welt in Gefahr, World in Danger, some folks when the German edition came out said, "Oh, come on, Ischinger, don't over dramatize. I mean, it's not really that bad, is it?" Looking back over the last 2 or 2.5 years, when the original German edition came out, if I had to do it again, I would now probably say, let's make it even more dramatic. Let's say world in great danger, because I think the international system has really deteriorated over this last period. Look, Cathryn, you mentioned 2014, when just a month or two before these momentous historical events in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine happened, we had the Munich Security Conference 2014. And then President Gauck made a big speech about how Germany should accept more responsibility in trying to shape international affairs and be a more proactive player on the international political scene. That was in February 2014. Mm-hmm. We did not know that Crimea was going to happen within weeks. We did not know that Brexit was going to happen within 2 years. We did not actually know that Donald Trump was going to be elected president of the United States. And I could go on and on. We did not know that, Orban and the Polish government would challenge our commitment in the EU to the rule of law and to the independence of the judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, even within our Western societies, things have started to fall apart. The United Nations Security Council, let's deplore it, has become extremely inefficient. The international system isn't working. Enormous changes are taking place. This is what we call in German eine Zeitenwende. An era is coming to an end, and we don't know yet exactly what shape and what kinds of challenges this next era will present. But now of course we are at a good point, because now we know a new president has been elected in the United States, and that for my generation, for me personally, that is extremely good news, because I think we will be capable of meeting these challenges: the rise of China, the migratory pressures coming to Europe from the south, the more aggressive policies of the Russian Federation, et cetera, we will be able to challenge those only if we can maintain a cooperative and trustful relationship across the Atlantic. And one final remark, what is the precondition for a meaningful cooperative international relationship? Of course, you can talk about the contents. How are we going to manage China? What are we going to be doing about Russia? But the essential point, in my view, as a practitioner of diplomacy, is what I call the 3 T's. T like in trust: truth, trust, and transparency. If the 3 T's do not exist in your relationship, you are in for, not very good results. If you have the 3 T's, if you have trust, if you have a commitment to truth and a rejection of, fake news, and if you have a commitment to transparent cooperation, then you have a chance of making it. That's also what the book is about.
Well, we've got to look back these past 4 years to look forward these 4 years, because I think your 3 T's were, by any standard of measure, violated or hollowed out over these past 4 years. And wherever I've gone over the last 4 years to have these conversations, I think particularly about how painful, and you see that in very straightforward surveys of German opinion vis-a-vis the United States. But I keep harping on, in part because of that last line of the speech that you referenced by our former federal president, Gauck, who called the Germans not to have hubris, but to be proud of what it had achieved in its own transformation, its own democratic transformation. I will never forget that line, because it was my first Munich Security Conference. And I think to a German American of my generation, I'm almost tearing up at the thought of those last lines about German responsibility because of who we are and how the country has transformed itself. We do have to think about the violation of these 3 T's over the past 4 years, where I would argue, despite the decreased trust that Germans placed in the United States, and we had a Kaba Foundation survey not too long ago in May that began to, in my mind, indicate something that I find quite dangerous, namely an equidistance between the United States and China. 36% of Germans thought it was important that we have a good relationship with China. Only 37% thought it was important we have a good relationship with the United States. That seemed to indicate the degree of pain. And I often liken this for Germans, particularly West Germans, who were raised in the three concentric circles that Adenauer mapped out for German foreign policy and policy in general, that sort of violated this basic premise. We were so genetically linked in our constitution, in the way that Germany runs its own federalism. You know, it was like a death in the family these past 4 years. And we saw that the Germans felt that worse than I think other European brethren. So if we lean into these three T's and the absence of American leadership in all the areas that you've just mapped out, the multilateral architecture, the relationship with China in a productive and functional way, contacts, productive contacts, if we think of nuclear non-proliferation regime that has had the meat bled out of it vis-a-vis Russia, we've made no progress through this emptiness of the American chair. How deep is that chasm effectively? How long will it take to rebuild, with an eye specifically to the German public or the European public that we've just talked about? How long do you think it's going to take to set that right, given the urgency of all the issues that you have so clearly mapped out?
Bad news first, if I may. Bad news first. The legacy of the Trump years will, of course, have a significant impact on transatlantic trust. Why? Because even if in coming weeks, months, and years, the Biden presidency will do all the right things, and even if, there's of course a big if, the Senate supports the new administration, and we can do wonderful things together on the international stage, there will be this lingering doubt in the minds of so many European intellectuals and political leaders. So, okay, we have this great trusting relationship with the White House and the entire the cabinet officials, but do we have a guarantee that after the next election cycle, we may not once again be confronted with a kind of a Trump number two? And if you look at European media, significant attention for, and of course that is not a surprise to anyone, has been paid to the fact that Donald Trump did get more than 70 million voters to support him and not the other side. So that is going to be a burden. Now, the good news is that I cannot think of a better person, speaking personally, I cannot think of a better person, a better leader sitting in the White House to try to do the necessary repair work, to do whatever it takes to erase these types of doubts. I think Joe Biden, who has, of course, played a role in the Senate for decades, and who came to Munich in 2009, having just been inaugurated, literally within days of the inauguration of President Obama, and he came and literally pushed what has come to be known the so-called reset button for a reopening of the relationship with the Russian Federation. That's not going to be forgotten. And as you recall, Catherine, he got a lot of applause as a former vice president, speaking in Munich last year when he actually said, we will be back. And there was so much applause. I know that I was not a very popular person at that moment in the Trump White House, I guess, having invited the former vice president. So my response to your question is, I think that Joe Biden can do a lot of successful repair work rather quickly. I also remember, and I'd like to recall what happened after the difficult years with George W. Bush. Remember, we had a problem about the Iraq intervention, certainly a bilateral problem of some dimension in 2003, 4, 5, etc. The moment Barack Obama showed up in Berlin to give a speech, even before he was officially anointed as the candidate of the Democratic Party, 200,000 people showed up. And they were happy to forget the difficulties with George W. Bush, and they embraced the new symbol. Now, why is that? Why are Germans so starstruck when it comes to a new and sympathetic American leader? The reason is, in my view, that we in Germany, we did not belong to the West, as, for example, France or the United Kingdom belonged to the West. Our British friends believe that they invented parliamentary system. The French believe that they invented, the separation of powers. So they think of themselves as founding fathers of Western freedoms and democracy. Germans were graciously invited to join the West after the devastations brought to the world by Germany in the 20th century. And for us, certainly for my generation and successive generations, the White House in Washington, America, was the leadership symbol of what the West stood for. So for us, far more than for my British or French friends, the disappearance of moral leadership, of the moral high ground from the White House over these last 3.5 or almost 4 years was, I think, a far more painful experience for Germans, because it's almost, as if you miss your grandfather, who is all of a sudden gone, sort of the family father. And I think that if Joe Biden does it right, my recommendation would be, if he could, to make a quick trip to Europe as quickly as possible, to show up there and tell Europeans, we stand by you, we're going to be with you, it's going to be tough. The pandemic and China and a huge number of other issues, but let's do it together. And I think he will be roundly applauded.
Well, I think your back channel is working, Ambassador Ischinger, because I am very close to people in the Biden camp, and that message seems to be getting through, which is a nice bridge to this next area I want to touch on, which is to say, yes, we're hearing nothing of messages of fealty and commitment, I think, from the Biden team, whether it's around this Congress, this meeting of democracies that Joe Biden's team wants to put together very quickly. We've heard about the Paris Climate Accord. He wants to rejoin that effectively on day one. He wants to fill multilateralism, which I argue the Europeans have been the muscle memory of, frankly, over these last 4 years with American ideas and values. Again, all the key institutions within the UN system, not least the World Health Organization that this administration left, but that are critical for us to solve these issues together. He wants to come back. And yet, I want to lean into what I find to be almost a schizophrenic dynamic at the heart of Europe that we've seen almost since the Saturday that we heard the news, which is to see in rapid succession over the past 10 days, the idea of strategic autonomy and the various different variants of how we might think about strategic autonomy as just what the word implies, meaning to say Europe capable of taking its own action in key defense and security issues, or the sort of more German vernacular around capacity to act, and the clashes that we are feeling within the EU around these issues somehow speak to exactly what you addressed before, which is that maybe to preserve the public's focus on continuing to be to put resources forth for security and defense. I'm thinking about taxpayer money, like keep them focused on the fact that these problems are real. That Europeans seem a little reticent to extend the hand and are, again, very much focused on what is the face that we as Europe present. Do we want the autonomous piece, or do we realize that, in fact, for all the challenges we have to face, again, we will be stronger together, and we need a strong line with the Americans, more in this idea of the capacity to act. So we saw that Macron interview, a number of speeches and interviews by the German defense minister, which seemed to indicate all these various different nuances. And I wonder if you could share with us, as someone who has been long, the behind the scenes architect of how in Germany, particularly, we need to rethink our defense and security architecture, down to asking for a German National Security Council, how you see this debate playing out inside Europe.
All right, that's a wonderful question. First of all, let me try to find support among those who are watching us discuss these matters here for the idea, on the basis of the experience of the last several years, of the idea that should we in Europe really make our existential security challenges dependent on the question of whether a couple of people will, in Pennsylvania or Florida, will elect this or that gentleman to be the next president. Again, I refer to this rather fundamental doubt about whether, what we are now looking at for the next 4 years, whether that will have a lasting effect. That creates in the minds of European policymakers, of course, the idea that can we do more on our own? And quite frankly, I would not overestimate the importance of this debate. If you go back in history, you can go back almost 50 years. And if you compare what Emmanuel Macron said about, the desirability of strategic sovereignty and autonomy, just the day before yesterday in an interview, and if you compare that to what Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer said in the speech which you referred to, compare that to what Le Général de Gaulle said in the 1950s or early 60s, and what Konrad Adenauer and other German leaders said. Essentially, we've always been repeating the same national wisdom. The French have said, we don't really need the Americans because we can be self-determined, and we are actually a nuclear power, and we sit on the UN Security Council. So they've been far more self-confident. The Germans have always said, since NATO was founded, and since we started building the European Union, we need both. We need NATO as our security environment, our guarantee, because we're a non-nuclear country and we are under threat. And we need to build the European Union to have a friendly neighborhood and to create a permanent system of European integration of which Germany will be the principal beneficiary, which is actually exactly what has happened over the last half century. So this difference, which comes out now in Emmanuel Macron here and Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer there, it is an expression of the different strategic and political culture and the different identity, security identity that our two countries have, that does not mean that we can't agree on a shared course of action. And so I would not overestimate the difficulty that might be created because Emmanuel Macron criticizes Madame Kramp-Karrenbauer and maybe vice versa. Look, I have great sympathy for Emmanuel Macron. He has a problem that we in Germany do not have. We're looking at an election in Germany, which, if I'm not completely out of touch with reality, will not lead to a major victory for the far right, and it will also not lead to a major victory of the far left. We will most probably continue to have the kind of a middle of the road political system. The French have a very different challenge. If Emmanuel Macron had to face an election tomorrow morning, he could conceivably be beaten by Madame Le Pen. Recent polls demonstrate that they're, almost on an equal footing. In other words, he has to make sure that the French believe that he is the leader. And that is why the idea of French strength and French role in the Middle East and France as a global power based on the history of France is also part of his re-election strategy. Mm-hmm. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. I think we will not have a big problem of Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel agreeing on a joint course of action when we really need to do that. So I'm not getting too worried about this apparent difference at this moment.
You've underlined why we need skillful diplomats who understand not only why things affect an international arena and agenda, but also pay close attention to the dynamics at home. And I think you just illustrated why you achieved what you did in your long career, because that takes nuance, it takes experience, and it takes an ability to explain that with clarity. So thank you, Ambassador Ischinger, for that. And I think it ties nicely to my first audience question, which has come in from Karl Lennartz, because it does go to the heart of what might happen between a Biden administration and a German chancellery. So Karl wants to know in which way you think the transatlantic relationship might influence the German election next year and new German foreign policy after the election. And I'll make a slight asterisk to this because you mentioned Brexit. With the Brits trying to renegotiate for themselves, quite literally, first of all, its relationship to the European Union, but also its role in the world. What we're seeing in the dynamic in the transition team with Biden is to say, well, our natural partner would be Germany. And I think you saw in the German foreign policy elite, Germans, the chancellery, quite eager first to lean into that dynamic, and then to see, again, what was happening internal to Europe, and then to try to say, okay, well, we have to, what I call the Scharniermacht Deutschlands, which is to say Germany is going to be in a position where it needs to basically satisfy many, many different partners. It's partners within Europe and have leadership, although we don't like to use that in the German vernacular, but have a leadership role there, not least financial. And then, of course, vis-a-vis the United States. So as you look to the election that Germany will have in the fall of next year, Angela Merkel will leave the chancellery. Already that will be a historic point. How is the changing dynamic over this next year in the transatlantic relationship going to impact the foreign policy that Germany can put on the table?
President Biden, once inaugurated, will make a big difference in Europe. Why? Because he is a committed multilateralist, and he has always supported the idea of European integration, and he has been critical of the Brexiteers. So I think that the Biden administration will actually help the EU overcome and manage the centrifugal forces that have tended to appear. I would be very surprised if the Prime Minister of Hungary would be the first to get himself invited to the Biden White House after the inauguration. That's what happened to Prime Minister Orban with Donald Trump. So I think that Joe Biden will demonstrate his commitment to the European Union, recommitting itself to the rule of law, to separation of powers, to the freedom of the judiciary. He will not express too much appreciation for the Brexit maneuver. So in other words, he will be the best friend we could expect to have over this coming period. And that would be a welcome, push for those forces in the German election process, which are pro-Europe, which are not populist, which are not nationalist, and which are not pro-communist. So in other words, I see a German election coming up where the role of America will be a stabilizing role, a role that will strengthen mainstream parties, if I'm not sure if that's the correct word, but will certainly not support the extremes on either side and in our neighborhood. So I think this is a most welcome role, and I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong in assuming that that's what the effects of the activities of the Biden presidency will be in this ongoing quarrel within the European Union about how important is the rule of law. Do we need to have a process in the EU that makes sure that our member countries do not go off course, abandon the fundamental principles of the EU treaties, the fundamental freedoms and separation of powers, etc. So I think this is all good news.
I do want to ask a question about the integrity of our democracies in a little bit, but I want to stay on something and pull together two questions that have come up that, again, lean on your diplomatic experience. I just lost the person who asked this question, sadly, but somebody said that, of course, when Rick Grenell took up his job in Berlin, this questioner asks, you sat down with him and you hopefully gave him some good advice, which he, based on what he did, obviously ignored, in terms of what to pay attention to in the European and in the German discourse. And I think there has been an enormous amount of activism, and I want to make sure we give Europe, and I think German foreign policy, the right credit, because after the Schockstarre that we felt, this sort of sense of shock and sadness and everything that we've already discussed, Germans got to work and Europe got to work. And we have now a German Indo-Pacific strategy, which will recall that another German federal president left his office voluntarily, but left his office because he implied the German strategic interests might need to be defended in that region of the world. So in my mind, despite the fact that you and I sing off of the same hymn sheet, and that the European and the German national security architecture needs to be overhauled and quickly, there has been, taken in the long run, remarkable progress over these last 2 years in certain areas. So if you were to sit down again with the American ambassador arriving in Berlin and say, here are the top 5 things that Europe has developed over the past 4 years, while there has been a leadership vacuum on the American side, that you should pay attention to, and where we can link up very specifically in policy areas. This gets to Daniel Tefelsky's question, so that we have more of a co-equal relationship in the transatlantic relationship. What are those 4 or 5 areas that are first at the top of your mind?
I wish I could talk about trade, but I'm a little reluctant to put trade at the top of my list, because I have to assume that returning to the idea of, TTIP will actually be an obstacle course for the Biden administration, just as much as it would be an obstacle course for many on the European side. So trade is a difficult one. It would be wonderful if we could counter the recent creation of this huge Asian free trade zone, which was just announced literally hours ago, a couple of days ago. If we could counter that by creating a more meaningful transatlantic trade bloc, but I think that is going to be extremely difficult. So let me mention 2 or 3 other items. We need to get the Middle East right, and that requires a leading role of the United States. My view is that we in Europe, we have the best of intentions, and we worked with the United States for a number of long years to get the so-called JCPOA, the Iran agreement, adopted and agreed by the Iranians. But that can only be the beginning. What we need to go far beyond the idea that maybe you want to move your embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and to have diplomatic relations of some Gulf states with Israel. That is not yet, I'm sorry to say, a security agenda for the region. And if we want something that deserves to be called a regional security arrangement that everybody can believe in and that can be constructed to be reliable and prevent the outbreak of hostilities, that's almost a historic task. But we need to return to that, and we can only do it together as a joint European-American project, number one. Number two, China. My view is that in the long run, the challenge of how to deal with China, how to approach the China challenge, is probably going to be, in my humble view, the most difficult transatlantic diplomatic task. Why? Because I see on the American side, interestingly enough, one area in foreign policy where there is bipartisan agreement. Everybody believes that China needs to be confronted. Even Joe Biden has said in the campaign, as I recall, I will be tough on China. And in the Senate, everybody supports that more or less. That is quite different from the mainstream thinking on the European side. The country that is most directly connected and dependent on China is, of course, Germany, because we're the biggest investor and trader, etc., in Europe with China. Our thinking is more along the lines: can we create a level playing field with China? That is a very different idea than the idea of confrontation. The idea of confrontation is either we Americans win or the Chinese win. So it's a zero-sum game. And if I've heard one of my strategic thinkers, friends in America say, if it turns out that the Chinese are about to win this competition, then the mission of the United States needs to be to slow them down. So it's really a kind of a zero-sum thinking. European thinking, as we speak, is more: can we still, even though there are difficulties, can we create a win-win situation, a level playing field on intellectual property, on reciprocity in investment access, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So consulting on China, coordinating China policy from human rights to the South China Seas, to how to deal with the violation of human rights in Chinese provinces like in Xinjiang, etc. I mentioned Hong Kong, etc. That will be a very, very important issue because it will be so important for the United States. The most difficult long-term challenge. Graham Allison has written this great book, which I read I benefited enormously from his insights.
And you cite in your book as well, the Thucydides trap.
Yes. Coordinating on China is really going to be very important. I participated in a project with our friend Karen Donfried of the German Marshall Fund, where a group of Americans and Europeans worked together to come up with some suggestions on how to take the transatlantic community forward. And one of our suggestions was recognizing the importance of the Chinese issue, of the China issue, is to suggest the creation of a very senior level transatlantic commission led on the American side by the Vice President of the United States, and maybe on the European side by some kind of a joint agreement between a joint group between the EU Commission President and senior representatives of NATO and of some individual European member countries. In other words, we need to take China really seriously because it could be extremely divisive if we cannot find a way to consult on these rather important strategic differences that divide us in how we should approach China.
In a shameless act of self-promotion, I will underline that, and Ambassador Ischinger knows this because in some regard we've worked hand in glove. We too will be publishing a report that takes some of the recommendations that Karen Donfried, Bruce Stokes, and Ambassador Ischinger put together in this GMF report a little further. We waited until we knew the results of the election. So in addition to the 3 big points that Ambassador Ischinger has just highlighted, we have a number of, and this is also, some of these ideas are in the GMF report, anchor points, connection points on critical issues like technology, on defining and redefining, creating a transatlantic Belt and Road initiative that has oomph and value and is imbued with the kind of things that make our economy strong, meaning to say democratic values and the laws and the arbitration, including antitrust and the kind of things that we have built with some resilience in the West to that. So that will come out in early December. So for all of those interested in reading that, I think you can read these 2 reports as paired documents and come out with a lot of actionability in that. I cannot let you go without talking about NATO. That comes up twice or 3 times now in our questions. And so we have a couple of questions here of people who are concerned about how the president might change the narrative on the 2%. Will he change the narrative around the 2%? Will we see a rethinking of what the 2% means? And in some respects, this is already a bridge to, I think, my last question, because and we'll get there in a second, because the subtitle of our talk is about the next generation. And I was very pleased to participate in a really dynamic session on NATO a week ago, which the Munich Security Conference hosted together with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, namely the NATO 2030 Youth Summit. And I was among the oldest participants there. So that gave me a lot of hope for the future because the ideas were exceptionally creative and they were different than I might see the situation. So Ambassador Ischinger, what do you expect out of a Biden administration vis-a-vis NATO and the heralded 2% goal, but in general about the sort of structure of NATO and how it might have to change to respond to all the challenges that we've mapped out?
Well, the first and by far the most important thing I expect is that the incoming administration will, without qualifications, recommit itself to NATO and will erase the doubts that have been created about the validity of the, Article 5 guarantee, etc. that in turn will make the doubts go away that have cropped up in Europe. Remember, Emmanuel Macron talked about the brain dead, NATO as being brain dead. Well, NATO can be seen as brain dead if there is no determined US leadership. NATO is built in a way that requires one member to lead. If there is no clear leadership, you would have a bunch of countries that would tend to disagree on everything. And NATO has actually worked extremely well over decades because of clear and unchallenged American leadership. So I expect that to be straightened out, and that will be good news. Second, however, the 2% issue, of course, will not go away. What I would hope we can do over the coming years in NATO is to focus a little less on the numbers game and to focus a little more on the real capabilities. Because as we have seen in the pandemic crisis, as our GDP, drops significantly, all of a sudden, our achievements in terms of reaching the 2% go up. Now, without adding a single tank or airplane or capability. In other words, the 2% goal is not a wrong criterion, but it is not perfect, and it should be. There are other criteria that might be added in order to make it more meaningful. Third point, and maybe in the longer term, the most important point, NATO needs to adapt to the new environment, which is an environment where kinetic energy, I mean, war fighting with and deterrence with kinetic weapons is going to be a thing of the past. We will need to develop NATO into an organization that can dominate the cyberspace, and that will be a leader in the application of artificial intelligence in the conduct of military affairs. So, in the past, and that's the interesting thing actually for NATO, but also for the Munich Security Conference, in the past, you could have meaningful discussions in NATO between generals and maybe some think tankers and a few political leaders and national security advisors. In the future, you need IT people, you need crypto experts, you need technology experts. And that is also true for the Munich Security Conference. I would be making a huge mistake if I invited the kinds of people who were the participants, let's say 20 years ago. I need to have industry leaders among the speakers and panelists and participants. I need companies like, they're not liked by everybody, but they play an important role, like Palantir and other data digesting companies. These issues will play an increasingly important role in how we manage the balance of power and how we can defend our interests, because in the future, we're not going to defend only our borders against tanks coming across the border. We will have far more complex challenges to our freedoms and to our security. And that is why I think as we look at these new technological challenges, NATO will not become obsolete. NATO will actually become centrally important, because you have enormous capabilities in America in these areas. And I think we also are beginning to, we've started to wake up and there are growing numbers of companies and institutions that can make interesting contributions to these new ways of confrontation, of disinformation, of manipulating public opinion, the non-kinetic art of warfare that we need to learn as we go forward. Thank you.
That brings me, I think, neatly to our last question, because we do want to talk about the next generation. And as somebody who has been able to attend the Munich Security Conference now for a number of years, I will remark very favorably on your efforts to create some intergenerational equity in an organization that, as Wehrkunde, was not designed to have that. And that brings that kind of expertise in. And again, I think at the NATO 2030 Youth Summit, you saw that. You saw all the people who were talking about biotechnology, viral technology, and prevention of bioterrorism, cyber, AI. You know, all the people on the panels were under 30 and, you know, with incredible knowledge that far surpassed, you know, right now the voices and people who might want to regulate that technology still. So we're at an interesting dynamic. So I thought, Ambassador Ischinger, maybe you could reflect a little bit on the generational change that you're witnessing and tie that to our last question here from the floor, from Harald Rothfuss, who also wondered about the other types of exchanges that we need in the transatlantic relationship to undergird everything, the 30,000 foot level we've already discussed. We also saw an atrophy of conversations between the Bundestag and houses of Congress, though we swore ourselves at the beginning of the Trump administration that would not happen, but it did happen. And it caused some misunderstandings around really critical issues like the F-35. So what are your hopes for other forms of dialogue and the role that particularly all these young people who are on this conversation with us can play for their future?
Well, you know, I mean, quite frankly, my job is now to retire as quickly as I can, because the next generation needs to come in and take over. I really strongly, I feel very strongly about that. It is not supposed to be a funny statement. I told my old, you know, all these old white men who've been participants in the Munich Security Conference. I told them a couple of years ago, I cannot keep inviting you guys, because if I do, I cannot bring in the next generation. I cannot bring in young women. And I need to bring in 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and I don't really need the 80-year-olds. There was actually one member of this group of 80-year-olds who congratulated me and said, "This is wonderful. I voluntarily give up my place, and I will be." I think I can share his name. Some of you may know him, Klaus Naumann, who was the senior-most German officer, Generalinspekteur, and most important military advisor at NATO. He said, "Don't invite me anymore. Invite my former advisor, who is like 38 or 39. He will benefit from participating in this august assembly." And we've been working hard, as you know, Cathryn, in changing the gender balance significantly. When I started out more than a decade ago, the number of female participants was significantly below 10%. We are now around 20, still not good enough, but you know, the curve is a little bit like the pandemic curve. It's going upward now. The pandemic curve is unfortunately going upward. The infection rate. Our curve is good news. We're moving in the right direction. We are bringing in the next generation, and I'm very, very happy about seeing a significant number of young members of the Bundestag that take an active interest in international relations. Let me conclude with one remark. When the current German coalition was put in place, they wrote a 173 pages long coalition agreement. And if you go through that, you find at the very end just a few pages on international questions, on foreign policy, on crisis management, on the strategic, on the need to bolster the strategic debate culture in Germany, etc. Just a few pages out of 173. That needs to change. That needs to change. Germany needs to become a country that is going to feel more comfortable in help lead the European Union, help lead the continent into a period that will be very dangerous. We will see more great power rivalries. We cannot assume that the United States will always bail us out. Whenever there is a little painful thing happening somewhere in Europe, we need to develop more of our own capability in order to be seen as a more meaningful and a more relevant partner for the United States going forward. So I'm confident, and I welcome all these young people, which is why we have this Munich Young Leaders Group, where we gather young, up and coming leaders from practically from all over the world, a couple of dozen, and some of my prominent participants, like in recent years, John Kerry and even Henry Kissinger said to me, the one thing I don't want to miss when I come to Munich is to meet with the Munich young leaders. And that's a great sign. So, and we'll keep doing that. Thank you very much.
Well, as someone who has been privileged to be a part of that cohort, I have to say that all the energy and creative thinking that's been put in the cohesion of that network has made it certainly my most enjoyable and most productive professional set of relationships, because exactly as you described, Ambassador Ischinger, when we all hit a wall in our daily lives, those are the first people we turn to. And as someone who's now had a privilege to go to a number of the Munich Security Conference gatherings, I will say the first time I was there was a very memorable picture of the four Nordic, including the German at the time, foreign and defense minister women, all in very bright jackets, who were representing for womankind. And if you compare that picture to the scene just this past February, you can tell that it's changed, in part because the women still wear those very brightly colored jackets and you can identify them from far away. So it has been a joy to see how this traditional organization has not only broadened its thematic focus, because it truly has, and its way of operating and taking the German national security discourse to the streets of Munich, because you also have a wonderful cultural program now around the Munich Security Conference in a number of ways of bringing in the public that I think are really original and creative, and that you and Benedict and everybody on your team, I think, deserves the rightful credit for. But I'm also heartened by all the people who have been with us in this discussion, and by people like Tim and Nenad and others who see themselves as the next generation of bridge builders, and who are doggedly in this fight to do the kind of work that Ambassador Ischinger has dedicated his life to, which is to really explain. And diplomacy is we describe it sometimes as menschlicher Nahkampf, because because you have to listen, you have to be present with people, and you have to understand where they come from and what makes them tick. And so to all of you who are here, who are dedicated to that bridge building, personally, I salute you. And I thank Ambassador Ischinger for this really forthright conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Cornigan. I'm a program assistant for this event. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to Ambassador Ischinger, Mrs. Clüver Ashbrook, all the participants, as well as the extraordinary team that made this all possible. Thank you so much. And please join our upcoming event. Yeah, thanks for showing your book. Thank you so much. This Friday, we'll have a virtual exhibition and discussion on COVID photography. And then next Monday, we are hosting German Federal Minister Jens Spahn for a discussion on crisis leadership. Register at GermanAmericanConference.org. See you there. Dankeschön.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Catherine. Great talking to you. Bye-bye. Wonderful.
Take good care. Stay
Yeah.
safe. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye.